one few key housekeeping rules before I hand it over to the speaker. Please keep yourself muted all the time. The talk will be there for about 35-40 minutes. After that, you can ask your question. You can post it on the chat box, or you can directly ask it by using the raise hand feature. The talk is going to be recorded, and just bring that to your attention. Over to you, Manju.
Hi, thank you so much for reading out that entire introduction. It had too many big words there. I'm always aware of that. I'm actually delighted to be speaking to all of you, and even to actually meet some of you on this online platform, and those of you who are at Krea, because I've really not had the opportunity at all to interact with anyone other than my lovely small class at Krea. So it's wonderful to actually finally meet some of you, at least this way. When Jaishankar actually got in touch with me sometime back, showing interest in an article that my colleague Kanchi and I had written last year, when the Chamoli floods had just happened, the February Chamoli floods. He specifically mentioned that article and said that there would be a lot of interest in these topics and issues in the Environmental Studies Department at Krea. So I'm actually looking forward to those discussions that we can have. And even once this discussion here is over, I'd love to have some offline discussions with those of you who are interested in this region and these topics, and who are probably also doing research on these issues. So so I'll just get into it and make a few present a few thoughts that I have on this question of Himalayan hydro, and then hopefully we can have discussions on some of the other aspects. So I'll start with the taking us to November last year, which is when the COP26 took place, and India announced, the Prime Minister of India announced India's new nationally determined contributions, which included a very ambitious, what many people call a very ambitious target of a net zero emissions by 2070, and that got a lot of media attention all across the world. There were two other targets for 2030, which I'm particularly concerned with. This is about creating a 500 gigawatt non-fossil fuel capacity in India by 2030. And also that by 2030, 50% of our total installed capacity for electricity would be through renewable energy. So these are the two important targets that I'm interested in today. And so this, it was a package of 5 targets, 5 goals, and it was termed Panchamrit. And as soon as the announcement was made, and it was in what has become a typical style of government, the announcement was a complete surprise. Nobody knew what was coming. And also, once the announcement was made, there was quite a bit of confusion about the when, how, what of these targets. Basically, what does it include? What does it exclude? What are the metrics to arrive at those targets and things like that. And so there was a lot of media discussion after the announcement was made. And then on November 9th, the Economic Times carried an interview with our Minister of Power and New and Renewable Energy, Mr. R.K. Singh. And I want to read some parts of his interview. He said, India will easily achieve the target. I have established a renewable energy capacity of 149 gigawatts. This includes large hydro projects. I have 63 gigawatts renewable energy capacity under construction. So I'm already at 212 gigawatts. So getting to further, let's say 300 gigawatts by 2030 or in a decade, I don't think that is difficult. So this is what, this interview was basically making clear what exactly the NDCs would be targeting. And according to him, the expectation that the central government has is that by 2030, 450 gigawatts would be from solar and wind, and about 70 to 100 gigawatts will be from hydropower, which is large dam building. And just to give you a sense of scale, what this 70 to 100 gigawatt of hydro actually means, India has over 4,400 large dams. It's the third largest dam builder in the world. And our installed capacity at this point is a little over 46 gigawatt, that is 46,000 megawatts. And so by 2030, if we are talking about 70 to 100 gigawatt, we're basically talking about adding or bringing into production about 25,000 to 55,000 megawatts. Yeah, that's just for scale. Now, so this discussion about whether hydropower should actually, and particularly large hydropower, should become part of the nationally determined contributions, and whether large hydropower should indeed be considered as renewable energy, this question has been sort of rife for a while. And definitely it's been around since the time of the Paris Agreement, when India submitted its nationally determined contributions in 2015, which stated that we would have 175 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2022. And so, back then itself, a lot of people felt that, and particularly a lot of people in the Ministry of Power felt that it was important to add large hydro to this mix, to this, so that we can achieve the goal of 175 gigawatt by 2022. And that was one of the reasons that hydropower would help us achieve the target that we had committed to the global community on climate change. But also the other major reason that was always given by the hydropower sector, and also then by the government itself, is that hydropower helps to stabilize a grid, an electrical grid that's largely dependent on solar and wind. Both solar and wind are are not stable entities because, depending on the time of the day or the season, the production varies. And therefore, as a means of stabilizing the amount of energy flowing through the grid, it's important to have hydropower as a backup. So these are the two main reasons that have been floated to talk about, to explain or justify why hydropower has to be in this mix and part of the nationally determined contributions. And what's important to know at this point in the policy discourse is that the policies make a distinction between small hydro and large hydro. This basically means that right from up until 1999, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy basically looked at all projects less than 3 megawatts as small hydro, and everything bigger than that as large hydro. Now, from 1999 onwards, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy has looked at projects less than 25 megawatts as small projects, small hydro, and more than 25 megawatts as large hydro. Now, this distinction has always, and therefore, small hydropower, which is less than 25 megawatt, has anyway been looked at as renewable energy. So what we're talking about now is a gradual shift where large hydropower is also to be seen and understood as renewable energy by policy and regulations. So, I'm interested in looking at energy transition and what it's doing to the entire energy space through a regional approach. There's a growing scholarship that's directed towards applying a regional approach to understanding energy transition, a spatial approach and looking at regions. How do climate policies shift energy geographies? And how do they create new types of regional competition? They anyway create sectoral competition, which is known to everyone, but how do they create different types of regional competition? And what are the roles of the state governments in this? What are these new energy regimes then that policy and regulatory changes are actually producing? These are some of the questions that have interested me for the last couple of years. And I'm also interested in looking at regional level studies to understand energy transition, because it's an important sort of medium scale understanding, which sort of adds to the scholarship and literature that's available on energy studies from a global perspective, from a national perspective, and from the perspective of communities. So I think the regional scale actually provides some interesting, will provide some interesting insights. I'm trying to basically do some work on understanding India's re-engagement with large hydropower as part of this regional dynamics of energy transition. Global and national policy discourses on climate change seem to have drawn these small border Himalayan state governments into these energy transition discourses. And what this has also done is that it has re-legitimized hydropower dams, the sector of hydropower dams, that has actually faced a lot of criticism because of financial, social, and environmental debacles. And now the sector hopes to reinvent itself in these discourses of energy transition. So Himalayan states, I'm particularly interested in Himalayan states because, everyone knows that they have huge hydropower capacities because of the fluvial energies of these mountain rivers. In some cases, singular power projects have cost more than the total outlays of the state, total budgetary outlays of the state. State governments of the Himalayan states have actively sought renewable energy status for their hydropower projects by saying that they don't actually have any other renewable energy in the form of wind or solar. And this is all material that's been documented in a series of standing committee reports, governmental reports of other kinds. As one of the representative in one of these reports, one of the representative of Uttarakhand government said that solar energy, wind energy, or any other form of renewable energy is always going to be smaller. For us as a state in the Himalayas, hydro is our main stake. There are lots of discussions in these documents about how hydropower does not even produce as much emissions as solar, and therefore they have a very good reason why they should be declared renewable energy. But of course, I'm not going to get into this because there are lots of debates about the greenhouse gas emissions of reservoirs, and there is a lot of scientific academic literature about whether greenhouse gas emissions are even being measured and accounted for correctly, and what are those methodologies, what should they be, and things like that. And this is an important aspect because methane is the second most important greenhouse gas emission after carbon dioxide. And there are studies which state that it has a much higher warming effect than carbon dioxide. So the question on dams and emissions is actually out there and being debated pretty extensively. But I want to look mostly at how the ambitions of these Himalayan states to seize the energy transition narrative illustrates what climate scholars have identified in climate policy, the shift from burden sharing to opportunity sharing. How do you take advantage of the renewable energy and energy transition discourses to actually come up with projects and policies that give you a regional advantage over others? In March 2019, finally, after a series of a number of efforts and advocacy efforts by state governments, In March 2019, the central government granted renewable energy status to large hydro projects which were above 25 megawatts. Not only did large hydropower receive this renewable energy tag, but this has also become a means to justify greater number of financial and regulatory incentives. Now, I'll get to that in a bit. Hydropower finance is actually a really, really crucial part, and a really crucial problem for the sector. It has been for a long time, and the sector has largely been dominated by public sector units precisely because private finance has not been very interested in the sector. And not only government funds, but also the funds of IFIs, international financial institutions, have been around in the early days. I'm talking about, Sardar Sarovar times. But obviously, all of that changed quite a bit because of the number of protests that took place all across the country. I mean, most people in the world know about the dams protests in India. It's been much documented and much discussed and much written about. And not only that, it's also about the number of delays that these projects were going through that made them a sector that private finance was not really interested in. And this has remained the problem, even though there have been major policy changes that have been made to make dams attractive to private finance, or to attract private finance to dams, however you look at it. But these policy changes or these policy processes have been a failure because they haven't actually been able to realize, the private finance in dams. Even project designs have been majorly influenced by the need to attract private finance and the need to make hydropower profitable to their investors. So for example, some of the major changes in designs that we have seen in the last 15, 20, 25 years is that multi-purpose dams have changed to becoming single-purpose dams as hydropower. Earlier, if you remember, much of the earlier dams in India were actually multi-purpose dams because they performed several functions at the same time. They had some irrigation component, they had some drinking water component, flood moderation, whatever. But those have actually changed. And now the new projects that are mostly coming up in the Himalayas are actually single-purpose dams, which are just for producing power for the markets. Even the designs in terms of the storage capacities, are these daily storage dams or are these seasonal storage dams? Are these cascade dams? All of these design components of these projects are basically meant to regulate rivers to make it profitable to generate power. And because of this, that we've always known that dam projects have certain kinds of environmental and social impacts, but these design and policy changes have actually exacerbated these the environmental and social impacts because of these projects. And that's primarily come from this single focus of looking at power production capacity of these projects. Now, despite these measures, that's policy measures and design changes and things like that, private finance has largely been reluctant to venture into remote Himalayan locations. I don't quite know as of now what is the contribution of private finance to large dams, but it's not very much at all. It's probably below 10%. It's because of that in the earlier decade, like for example, 2003, 2004, 5, during those years, projects that were coming up, dam projects that were coming up in different parts of India did try to attract CDM projects under the Kyoto Protocol. And that actually backfired pretty badly because dam projects which were anyway problematic and where environmental and social impacts are not mitigated to the extent required, those problems actually got internationalized because of the contribution of international funds through CDM. Similarly, if I take the case of dams in Arunachal Pradesh, which were, I mean, Arunachal Pradesh had very, very big estimates in terms of how much electricity generation that they can have from their from hydropower, because they had a large number of very major rivers, but still, and Arunachal did try to experiment with the public-private partnership model. But still, there were not too many big private players who came into the scene. And journalists have done some very fascinating work on understanding, the financial arrangements for these projects. They basically found that it was small construction and engineering firms who were basically looking to make their portfolios look good, who had invested in these projects and who had come into partnership with the state government of Arunachal Pradesh. But many of these public-private partnerships actually eventually failed, and public sector, that is National Hydropower Corporation, had actually had to step in and take charge of some of these projects. So clearly, all our efforts at policy changes and project design changes have not really done the job in terms of attracting private capital to large dams in the Himalayas. So what the government is looking to do now seems to be based on a template for success that Himachal Pradesh has done, and I'm using success. I'm just quoting what government documents say about this. Clearly, the people of Himachal Pradesh would not agree with this idea at all. So states are basically, Himachal Pradesh is basically being able to, take advantage of small hydropower being seen as renewable energy by basically allowing a large number of private players in it. And in order to incentivize private players in small hydro, they have basically used regulatory exemptions, like, for example, they don't need to take consents from local people. They don't, land is provided cheaply, and the state electricity board offers to buy a certain percentage of hydropower that's generated. So some of these components are now largely seen as a template for doing the job for hydropower. And basically states are using the renewable energy, looking to use the renewable energy tag to take advantage of the legitimacy and social organization of renewable energy, or this energy transition as a sort of a space. There are already, the moment, renewable energy projects in the form of wind and solar energy, they already have a number of environmental regulatory exemptions. And that's not gone down very well in certain places. Like, for example, we've been hearing the problems of grasslands being converted into solar farms and what that might lead to in terms of extinction of wildlife species and things like that. Small hydro has always had a lower standard of scrutiny from environmental regulatory procedures such as EIA. So, for example, right from 2006 in the EIA notification, projects that are between 25 and 50 megawatts, that is small hydro is 25, and up to 50 megawatts have actually been placed in category B, where they have a lower standard of scrutiny for environmental impacts. And then, so these like, for example, in Himachal also, there's a lot of protest because in recent years, the small hydropower projects have basically been exempted from Gram Sabha consent for the use of forests. So these are ways in which once the projects have a renewable energy tag, then that becomes a reason to actually reduce the regulatory and the regulatory oversight on these projects, and also provide different kinds of financial incentives. Some of the major financial incentives that that large hydro stand to gain now, because they are called renewable energy, is budgetary support from the central government for any project that has a flood moderation component. And if there is any other related infrastructure that is required for the production of, to set up these projects. And in the Himalayas, this is really crucial because road construction, road expansion is actually a really important need so that there is greater access to these hydropower sites. And so road construction and road expansion, these kinds of infrastructure developments are going to be supported by budgetary allocations of the government. And, I mean, these have been some of the issues that at least the public sector involved in hydropower have been asking for a number of years. So government agencies have basically come on to the fact that they would have to provide the enabling infrastructure for hydropower generation at public cost. And so much of the Himalayan road construction should actually be seen as part of incentivizing hydropower generation in the Himalayas. Another way in which hydropower is going to be financially incentivized is by making discoms purchase hydropower. So just like how discoms have renewable purchase obligations, basically they have to buy a certain percentage of their total energy from renewable energy producers. In a similar manner, discoms are now going to have to buy hydropower from these hydropower producers. But everyone knows that hydropower is actually much more expensive than wind and solar. And so if this is done, then discoms are likely to transfer those costs to consumers. So in some ways, these are the major financial incentives and regulatory incentives that they're looking to provide to hydropower to make it feasible for private finance to invest in them. But if these succeed, if all of these policy measures succeed at what they are aiming to do, it basically means that the Himalayan region will become the densest dammed region in the world. That's because there are a large number of players in the Himalayas, national governments, which are already doing a lot of dam construction in this region. Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, China, all of them are major dam builders, and they are looking to make use of these opportunities. And so this is actually going to become a major hydropower. The Himalayan region as a whole is going to become like a major hydropower hub, if it already isn't one. And the geopolitical significance of this region is known to everyone. And so how this will influence hydropower production in this region, and what would this dams race actually look like, is something that a lot of scholars in international relations and security studies have been concerned about, and they've written about it. And I mean, so in a sense, these are some of the overarching concerns there are about converting large hydro or looking at large hydro in policy discourses as renewable energy. But I mean, from the ecology and development, Himalayan development point of view, these projects have always been a huge problem. The Himalayas, I mean, as everyone knows, it's one of the most ecologically sensitive, biodiversity rich areas. These are young mountain ranges, and so they are very fragile, especially in the context of large construction. The region is seismically very active and receives very heavy rainfall. I mean, because of these factors, it makes the region very vulnerable from these aspects, from these environmental aspects. It's also the basis of life and livelihood for nearly a quarter of the world's population. And I don't think that this statement actually takes into account all the downstream populations, the large number of people living in these by the side of these rivers, much further downstream after these rivers have left the Himalayas. So clearly it's something that influences so many people's lives. And the Himalayas have been called the water towers of Asia because they are the main source of water for much of the Asian continent. And as we know, dams basically privatize and regulate river flows for the project. Now, in terms of, we have seen so many catastrophic events that have taken place, in these regions, whether it's the Kedarnath floods of 2013, where over 5,000 people at least died, and the Chamoli floods of last year. And these events, of course, they affect people living in the area and their property and livelihoods in a major way. But then these disasters also seriously affect hydropower projects that are that are under construction or in operation in these areas, and also damage large numbers of public infrastructure like roads and bridges. And so the long-term impacts of these kinds of events are really severe. And it's important to say that the particular types of hydropower projects that are being built in the Himalayas involve a large amount of tunneling operations. Basically, these are water diversion projects. And so the mountains have to be cut extensively to create these tunnels. And that creates, I'm just talking about one of the main issues of these types of projects. It creates so much excavated debris, and there's no place to store them. And so invariably, almost every project actually has dumped it back into the river, and that actually changes, it can actually change the course of these rivers downstream. And there are several cases on this muck dumping into the river that are going on in the National Green Tribunal and the other courts. So what we're actually, some of these things that I've just mentioned, these are just things that we know of. If we look at the Brahmaputra River system that flows through the northeast, much of this is not even known because a large parts of the Brahmaputra River system is actually outside India, in China, and we don't really have accurate data or timely data to understand what's happening on the other side, and which can explain why rivers are behaving the way they are on this side. And so there have been a number of cases where there have been temporary obstructions on rivers due to debris or landslides that have taken place across the border. And at some point, those temporary dams just burst, and then the downstream areas are all flooded. And so, these kinds of events just tell us that the Himalayan river courses and landscapes are actually being rapidly and massively transformed right before our eyes. And it seems that local people who are facing these impacts on a daily basis, and more importantly, migrant construction workers, most of them are migrant construction workers, who pay the price for this so much, because many of these projects are actually affected during every monsoon. So given all of these impacts, I just want to look at public policy and dams. Many of you are probably doing work in these regions, in these states, in the Himalayas. And you know that the one thing that everyone gets to hear is this Neta Babu Thekedar nexus. Basically, the politician, the government official, and the contractor. This triad basically runs the political economy of these states. So despite all of these impacts and all of these major events, these projects keep coming because, thanks. These projects keep coming because this is basically the foundation of the political economy of these states. And the typical profile of Himalayan economies is a very high dependence on construction contracts. And these construction contracts mainly come to people who have friends in high places. And that basically runs the setup in the economic and livelihood setup in these areas. So clearly, you know, and they get to run the political economy of these states, even though practically every region where hydropower is being proposed or hydropower projects are in operation or under construction, there have been large-scale protests of different kinds in every part of the Himalayas. So if you look at you know, Sikkim, there have been major protests that have gone on for years. If you look at Arunachal Pradesh, it has happened in particular areas like Tawang and Dibang and Lower Subansiri, and some of these projects that were supposed to come up in the early 2000s in Arunachal Pradesh, they have been tied up in litigation for over 10-15 years and are now gradually sort of getting revived in the state. Then if you look at Uttaranchal, the major projects on Bhagirathi and Alaknanda, the major tributaries of the Ganga, these have seen a lot of different kinds of protests, including at the highest level with Minister Uma Bharati actually speaking out against these projects. And similarly in Himachal, recently in Kinnaur, there was this no means no, you know, as the basic slogan of their protests. In Assam, there have been a large number of protests of what the upstream projects in Arunachal would do to the Assam plains. So there have been lots of protests. I mean, there are clearly lots of protests, and many of these have been documented extensively, both in the media and by all the scholarly literature on some of these projects. And in each of these protests, different aspects may have been politicized. So it's not, these protests they may look the same, but they're not really the same because they're based on very different kinds of issues, which are important to certain groups of people in these areas. And the protests, you know, how long they last, you know, will they outlive the active period of project planning? These are all very important questions, you know, that determine whether these projects will come up or whether the protests will be successful or not. And so these protests are heavily dependent on the collective agency of the people who are protesting, and dependent on what is their negotiating power with the state government, which has such an important role to play in how these projects will pan out. Yeah, so it seems from all the existing literature there is on large dams from across the world, it seems the Himalayan and on the basis of all of these particular issues and problems of the Himalayan region, it seems that the Himalayan people are actually trapped in a certain mode of development that is very hydropower focused. And many experts, like, for example, Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, have said that, this is being fixated on large dams in these times he calls it hydrological obscurantism. Basically saying that climate change has completely transformed the water cycle and our rivers, and therefore to be focused on large dams, like as if our hydrological data is going to help us decide where to put up a project and how to put up a project. He feels that it's completely pointless. And looking at what climate change has done to the Himalayan region, or is doing to the Himalayan region and rivers, it looks like we have to factor in the unpredictability and of these environmental factors in this region. And it certainly, this unpredictability certainly does not allow us to continue our conventional approach of deciding on these projects. And our conventional approach has been a cost-benefit analysis or a risks and rewards approach. And given the levels of unpredictability involved now, it's not possible to continue with that kind of decision making. And in any case, I mean, even if by some technological advancement, we are able to predict and provide or find and collect important data or predict impacts, it's known by now across the world that dams have not delivered economic development. So there's scholars call put dams in the category of mega projects, and they say that there is an iron rule of mega projects. It's basically cost and time overruns perpetually. And so dams are very much, these projects very much suffer from these problems. And so, it could just end up being a situation where people, even if they don't have their own reasons to oppose the project, it could just be a situation where they're waiting for development to take place in the form of hydropower. A lot of scientific, the Himalayas have really gained a lot of scientific attention in the last few years because of climate change. And not only that, there's so much documentation now about how communities live the climate change impacts in the Himalayas on an everyday basis. And yet it's quite unfortunate and ironic that large dams have been repackaged as renewable energy, and they form a part of India's nationally determined contributions on climate change. Yeah, I'm done for now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Jaishankar, you want to proceed with the...
No, please continue.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you, Professor Menon, for the illuminating talk. We have, it was very well received. So I have already posted the question. Yeah, there is a question in the chat box.
Okay.
Do you want me to read?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. In the context of this, in the context of the discourse on how the country needs more energy production, what are the alternatives for hydropower in producing renewable energy on a larger scale?
You mean if not hydropower, then what? Is that the?
Yes, I think she said.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like if we look at this question in terms of different kinds of technologies for energy production, then it's obviously a difficult question. I think what's more important, and I think people have said this even in the context of renewable energy targets, and this ambitious program to build solar farms of really large at really large scale, and wind farms all across the coast or all across the mountains. Basically, I think the understanding is that we have to do something about the demand for energy, where it's coming from, what it's for, because it's clear that our energy consumption landscape in the country is actually extremely unequal. That's because we are an unequal society in all respects. And so there's no reason to expect energy consumption to be to show any other pattern. And so so there is clearly a need to have energy production for everyone. But then the question also is, what are our patterns of energy consumption? Where is it coming from? And whether we can actually rationalize energy consumption in any major ways. And of course, I mean, at some point that conversation pretty much hits the wall of what are modern lives all about? I mean, how much is enough? Would we ever actually reach a point where we're able to, I mean, is it even possible to imagine that we can actually produce energy at an infinite sort of scale. So I think that question takes you in all sorts of different directions. But I think if I were to answer it just in terms of a policy question, I feel like there are major questions about the demand estimates made by our energy bureaucrats. There's a major question mark about whether we actually, as a country, require that much energy, and maybe the estimates are off. And so it's important to actually get good data to kind of understand, what is our energy demand landscape.
Anyone wants to ask any questions directly?
And I think that,
Yeah, please.
before we get another question, I feel like most of these energy projects, which are large-scale energy projects, are actually being questioned for environmental and social impacts. I mean, you take every kind of energy project, including, I'm very scared about waste to energy plants. They're sort of really mushrooming all over the place. So the waste to energy plants, solar farms, wind projects. Solar farms have become a problem because they are basically taking over common lands, which are commons meant for everyone, and they seem to be affecting certain groups of people who are already oppressed, who are already sort of marginalized. Similarly, wind farms, typically come up either in the coastal areas or they come up on, in these forest regions. And so that has its own challenges. So clearly, most of these projects are running into certain kinds of challenges in terms of how to deal with environmental and social impacts. It's not that it's only about hydropower. I think we're also going back to nuclear. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, Chirag.
Hi, Manju. Thanks very much for this talk. It's actually I find it very frustrating, honestly, to think about these issues, because the only alternative to large hydro in terms of backing up the grid, the future grid, given the transition to solar and wind, is either nuclear or natural gas or batteries. I don't see any other option that can possibly back up the grid. Now, each one of these is problematic for different reasons. Natural gas, aside from anything else, of course, availability is a problem, quite aside from. Now, given this sort of deadlock, it seems really to me that demand reduction is really the only thing that we can really focus on. Do you sort of also, of course, you already said that in a way, but I really don't see any other way of handling this. So what, really, are you optimistic that there can be any other solution? Can there be any other solution?
Well, I mean, we leave optimism out of this discussion, but I just feel that, of course, it's not an enviable, it's not an easy task at all for governments who are sort of wanting to decide how we're going to proceed with, providing electricity for everyone and things like that. There's no doubt that it's a very complex issue, and clearly, most people understand this complexity because there's so many energy experts just grappling with all of these issues almost on a daily basis, and they've been doing this for a number of years. But I do feel that climate policy and energy policy debates tend to sort of focus too much on the numbers. They tend to focus too much on the targets and the, and the models that are available to actually figure out how to proceed. And they actually speak much less to people in different places and really understand what kinds of impacts they're dealing with and what their concerns are and things like that. I do feel that, I do feel that at least this should be an opportunity. I mean, this recognition that it's a very complex task and it's a humongous challenge to do energy planning in this country. At least that should become an opportunity to open up the conversation to those people who you don't normally see in these policy rules. I don't know if that in itself will solve the problem. I'm not sure about that. But I think at least we might expand our options a little bit from, just in terms of how we frame the questions about what do we do. I don't know whether that accounts for optimism. I don't know whether you can call it that.
Well, the pragmatic problem remains of backing up the grid to make it reliable. And when framing the question in a larger way is critical, of course. But just answering this one question about how do you make the grid reliable has very few solutions that I can think of. But each one of them with very specific sort of problems. So in fact, I guess this is not so much a question so much as, this just kind of really highlights the kind of talk you've just given. It really spotlights the kind of, rock and a hard place kind of situation we find ourselves in. So just, something, I guess, just random thoughts, I guess I'm putting out there.
Yeah. Aditi?
Yeah, thank you. Manju, absolutely amazing talk. And I also wanted to say that Chirag raised a very important point, something that was also on my mind. What I wanted to ask is, when it concerns hydropower, especially, how you highlighted that the Himalayan region being very fragile in terms of ecosystem and how it tends to affect communities which are already oppressed or marginalized. Well, first of all, the current EIA or the environmental assessments that happen, they seem to be, very, very diluted in terms of how much damage they can do to the ecosystem. And often they do not include what happens into these specific communities. So my point is, when we talk of creating climate policy or energy policy, how would we be able to sort of surpass or include this particular aspect of how it affects specific communities who are, first of all, not even on the won't even be the ones who will be using these energies on a large scale themselves. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think, I think now most people who work in the environmental field know that the processes for environmental impact assessment, they actually hide much more than they reveal. And it seems in terms of how these are implemented, how these procedures are implemented, it's more as a way of distracting and diverting attention from the real issues, and somehow try and ensure that projects get these approvals and deal with the consequences of these projects whenever and if at all they come up. So that's pretty much been it's become normal for environmental impact procedures to actually treat projects and people in this kind of way. So yeah, I don't think we can look to those, although, having said that, the very fact that the EIA withholds information or environmental impact procedures sort of prevent people from gaining access to information or prevent people from actually participating in decision-making processes, that itself tends to politicize many of these projects. And eventually, because once these projects get politicized, then as we've seen in the case of many, recent projects, hydropower projects in the Himalayas, they've gone into litigation, and the legal processes have actually, been a forum where much of this information that was hidden or that was not stated, so that projects get approvals, that have all actually come out. That data and the information on those projects, which are actually relevant for people, that stuff has come out through court proceedings. In some cases, the courts actually set up expert committees. Like, for example, after the floods of the Kedarnath floods of 2013, Professor Ravi Chopra was heading a committee, a high-level committee that was set up as part of one of the cases, and they did an excellent job of putting together a report that looks at how hydropower projects make areas vulnerable in the Himalayas, how they actually add to the vulnerability that already exists. So it seems that the formal procedures that are related to project approvals, those actually in an indirect way end up leading to these other processes, which then help to generate the important information and knowledge on these projects. Yeah, but I mean, clearly that's a very that's a long process most of the time. I mean, there's a lot of waiting involved in that, because many of these cases take more than a decade. And in some cases, it has meant that the viability or the financial viability of the project itself has come under serious question because of those delays. And that's why you see these kinds of situations where the government's trying to somehow, get private investors to come back to the sector.
Thank you for that reply.
Yeah, I just want to expand on Aditya's question, considering there are no other questions. So once I was traveling to Thailand about a decade back, and I was so surprised to hear that different malls in Bangkok are apparently run by the electricity generated in various hydropower dams in Laos. And they're literally telling, like, okay, this mall is driven by that hydropower dam, and not in the same country. It is obviously exploitation there. So my question is, in this context, do you think that hydropower, hydropower, because of its location specificity in terms of where it's generated, and generally there it's not consumed, it provides a more scope for environmental justice concerns, raised in compared to other renewable energy technologies. So that is the one question. And the second, a more factual question is that, have you seen like gravitational storage as a battery technology, whether it is picking up in India? Though I am not very aware. I know that there are some discussions around gravitational storage and how it can be really revolutionized battery or energy storage technology. So yeah, like, whether it has picked up in India. Yeah.
You mean pump storage type of?
Yes, like, putting water high up and then releasing it during the lean period. Yeah.
I think those are coming back to become a major part of the hydropower portfolio, pump storage projects. But I think there's still a major attraction for these large hydropower projects, or a series of large hydropower projects. So I think the first part of your question is interesting about, because dams are situated projects, and so they probably have, sort of create a different sort of dynamics about energy production than other kinds of projects. Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why dams the world over have seen the kinds of public participation, around dam projects, whether it's in the form of protests or whether it's in the form of just sort of negotiating with these projects to understand, how that can become part of economic development of certain areas. They are, I think that's the reason why dam projects have this kind of public attraction in most places.
Yeah, thank you. But also, like, just to understand, like, do you see that the scale of the hydropower projects are the problem, or you feel like if we because now there are a lot of discussions around decentralized power generation, and the idea of prosumers is kind of coming up, where producers are also consumers, and it's like kind of like there are a lot of projects, a lot of push towards that, right? So
Yeah.
do you see that like small scale hydropower projects which can actually support the adjacent areas can actually be quite I would say environmentally less impactful, but or you feel that still it's quite dangerous to take that route?
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel that in this context, the issue is not so much about the size and scale, but it is about how it is planned, who runs it, who controls it, and what kinds of functions it plays at the level of the community or at the level of a particular region. So, for example, I mean, we've had a huge network of small, micro, mini sorts of projects, and these have in many places, these particularly in the Himalayas, like for example in the Northeast, these have played a very important role in providing power to people who are actually mostly not connected to the grid at all. So, for example, I remember in Nagaland there was this experiment with these. They were called hydrogels. So basically, they would, it would be a small sort of dynamo in the water stream, and most of these were perennial water streams, and it would light up, houses in the neighborhood. But I guess then the question also then from there on is, what kinds of energy services are we actually talking about? I mean, if it's just lighting up places, then it would be a completely different scale of energy production that's required. But if it's other kinds of energy services, high-end guzzling, like for example, I mean, we are basically looking at air conditioners being the biggest source of power demand, right? In a few years, it's going to kind of completely go out of I mean, I don't even think the estimates have a clear picture on that. So if we're talking about that, then obviously the options that we are working with have to be very different. So I guess, I mean, it's not a straightforward question of the size of projects, I would think, because I mean, it's a lot of friends have done work on how in the Himalayan region particularly, and also in the Western Ghats, I think that small hydropower has an equally damaging sort of effect on the environment, because basically these are all on the rivers, the tributaries or river streams that people actually use. Unlike, the major rivers, which people don't necessarily use for their everyday purposes, it's the smaller, rivers and tributaries that people actually sort of depend on. And most of these smaller projects are actually put up in those rivers.
Yeah, so I think it boils down to the environmental governance question, which I think you rightly mentioned, like how you're governing that, whatever the infrastructure that you're establishing. I think that's the $1 million, be it the forest, be it here, everywhere, it's the governance which is the problem. Okay, any other questions from anyone else? Okay, so I think it was a great listening to you, Dr. Menon, and I think all of us has gained a lot more insights about the whole, like the issue of hydropower and the fragility of Himalayan region, and why you should be careful in taking this route. Because I oftentimes feel like the sustainability concerns, the sustainability pathways needs to be verified from the justice point of view. Otherwise, we might run into a lot of problems, because we might just run for sustainability and create further justice concerns and marginalize the already marginalized population even further, and create their lives more difficult. Yeah, thank you again for the talk. I hope all of you enjoy, and hope to see you in the next talk, which is going to be in the next month. You will get the announcement soon. Bye.
Yeah,
Have a nice
thank you so much. This was a wonderful opportunity. I'm glad. Thank you.
Thank you.